Let's take a look at the Nissan RE4R 4-speed automatic transmission for the VQ35DE engine. Here we can notice the transmission dipstick provision, oil cooler line banjo bolt, and the gear selector switch. The rear output shaft speed sensor harness was also cut. What's most important before disassembling is standing this transmission on its tail for draining most of the fluid. Notice the output shaft speed sensor, left side cooler line fastener, turbine input shaft sensor. We want to disassemble the inside of this transmission for a wet clutch and steel plate inspection. Here we can notice the identification tag from the Jatco Corporation specifying its model. Now we want to detach this transmission bell housing and remove the torque converter for inspection of the internal of the Nissan RE4R automatic transmission. With the transmission fluid completely drained from its tail shaft by standing it up, it is now time to remove the torque converter, and we must place a cardboard and a container to catch any remaining oil that will spill inside of the bell housing during removal of the torque converter. It is mandatory to protect the neck of the converter by applying a thick layer of grease to the converter neck seal connection. Is important to prevent corrosion. The surface of the neck where meets the seal must remain absolutely smooth. A look inside the transmission bell housing. A total of 10 12mm bolts that has to be removed for detaching the bell housing from the transmission case. In the center of the transmission are the stator support shaft and the turbine input shaft that also have to be disassembled with the transmission bell housing. First thing we want to do is flip the transmission around. We want to remove the transmission sump pan for a inspection. Attached to the transmission sump pan are 20 10mm bolts that require removal for detaching this pan, draining all its oil from this bolt when it is in the vehicle. A 10mm 1/4-inch drive ratchet will be required to remove the 10mm bolts. Removal of this sump pan is the first step for your inspection. Based on the contamination level inside this sump pan will determine whether inside the transmission clutch and steel band will require inspection. Since this transmission is used, most likely it will require a inspection of the wet clutch and the steel band inside the transmission case. Let's remove this pan to verify that. Fluid that was removed from that transmission drain plug was placed into this jar, and you can see when we shake it, it has a dark red to it, kind of like a brown. That is a sign of contamination from the clutch inside of the transmission, which is a normal situation. The transmission has mileage to it. That fluid will enter inside that torque converter, which is also normal. We also want to paint that converter on the outside before installing it. Let's go inside to this transmission for a inspection. With all the 10mm bolts removed from the transmission pan, it's now for detaching and inspection. With the pan removed, the first thing we want to look at is inside on the bottom. We will notice on the edge there's this gasket which must be protected and replaced. We also want to look at the sludge, the metal that's developed on this magnet. So we don't have any sludge on the bottom of the transmission, but we want to take a look at the bottom of the transmission case, and you can see the oil that's sitting on it. You see the color? Well, that's a color of usage in the transmission. So now we have to go inside and look at the clutch of the transmission to verify that no contamination clogged this filter that will most likely restrict fluid. But based on the bottom of this transmission pan, it does not look to be the case. And this is a normal buildup of mallory on the magnet for a transmission with approximately 100,000 miles. So we now have to go into this transmission. We're going to replace the pan because we're going to have to place the transmission on the pan. This is a part series. In many series to come, we will see more on the internal of the transmission. So this is the ideal position for placing the transmission, for detaching this bell housing. Also, standing the transmission up, remember, is to drain all the fluid out from inside the transmission. Now with the bolts inside this bell housing detached, the bell housing could be removed and we could inspect inside the transmission clutches, steel bands, seal and bushing for good condition. With a 12mm short socket, half-inch drive preferable to reduce the twisting of the leverage on the tool for removing the bolts to help detach this bell housing. In the service manual, the diagram shows that this bell housing is detachable from the transfer case and the front pump. So you always want to make sure you're wearing a glove, because you could cut your hand on the side of the transmission. So most of the time you're going to use a power tool for releasing these steel bolts. And in some case, the steel bolt will damage the aluminum threads. That's why it's always best to use a hand-driven tool. And of course you want to use a power bar for untightening these bolts. Then you can simply just walk them out by hand. You want to take an inspection at the bolt. You want to make sure you look at the bolt that is in good condition. And from based on what we can see here, we can see the bolt has some gray silicone on it. And this is a sign that someone has been in here before, probably to change some part, or maybe the transmission was rebuilt. Here you can see more silicone. That's a gray silicone that was placed on the bolt to help seal this area, which is not really necessary. The bolts only need oil on the threads and to be torqued to factory specification. Remember, anytime a steel bolt, which is most of the time, will enter a aluminum casting, the torque is essential and most important. Failure to torque will definitely cause the whole assembly to come apart. And if you over torque these bolts, when the equipment become hot, the metal will expand and could most likely cause stretching of the threads, breakage of the threads. So this is very important when dealing with automatic transmission with aluminum casting and steel fastener. Once all these bolts has been removed, we will attempt to remove this bell housing without the front pump. But in some case, this will not happen, because the front pump will always remove itself, detach with the bell housing, causing the pump to become separated and fall apart. So this is going to require playing with. So the best place for working on transmission is on a steel table. We want to detach this bell housing where the screwdriver is inserted. So you never want to use a hammer, you want to use a mallet for shocking the bell housing, basically breaking it away from inside the transmission main body. This is going to require prying away from the body for detaching, because the bell housing is not detaching itself from the front pump. Since the bell housing is not detaching from the front pump, we will have to use this screwdriver and pry the front pump with the bell housing together away from the transmission casting. With the front pump and the bell housing will come out together from the front, of course, and this will expose the internal pump. So we're going to pry on this bell housing. We want to get this whole assembly to come forward, turning on this input shaft, making sure it does not get in the way, because that input shaft is inside of this front part, and on the back of the transmission is an output shaft. So when we look at the top here, we could see the input shaft speed sensor is what holding the whole assembly back from coming off. Removing these two 10mm bolts, you can already see someone was in here, because the sensor has a crack on it and there is some red silicone on the bolts. There is no reason for placing silicone on the threads of the bolt. The bolt is require a lubricant and torque to specification. So here you're going to see the whole sensor is going to fall apart Once we're going to take it out, and this is going to require replacing with a new input speed sensor. This is an input shaft turbine speed sensor. It records the speed of the center shaft inside of this transmission bell housing. Now that this sensor is out of the way, this bell housing and the front pump will most likely come together, requiring jiggling it, rotating it back and forth, or releasing it from the clutch and its input shaft. Now that we have this assembly apart, this input shaft here, you'll see how it's restricting the whole system from coming out because it's holding that reverse drum clutch. So this sensor is going to have to get replaced when the transmission is going to get rebuilt after inspection. Now we want to move to the inside. You see that red silicone on the threads? That's evidence someone has been in here before. So let's take this pump apart to see if we could detach that bell housing from it. Here is a diagram of the RE4R transmission bell housing and the oil pump, which is separated but is not in our case. This front pump is held to the bell housing by 8 12mm bolts that require detaching for lifting it off of the bell housing. So detaching of these bolts is also important. Like I've mentioned before, anytime you're disassembling equipment, you want to always inspect the bolt, making sure the threads is in good condition, and also the part that's holding these bolts are in good condition. Most of the time you want to place this stuff in a vise, holding it in position while you're releasing the bolt, because it will take some form of effort and twisting. Don't want this stuff to fall on your feet or you to tumble with it on the floor. It is not recommended that a transmission be disassembled or assembled on the floor. We are simply doing this because this transmission came out of the salvage yard. If it's shown to be malfunction or broken or excessive wear and tear on the inside, then all the internal part will be cleaned with kerosene oil and assembled on a table with a steel deck, not wood, not cardboard, or any fibrous material. You have to understand, during the course of reassembling, you have to keep dirt out of the transmission. So here you're going to see there's a provision for that same input shaft speed sensor. On that shaft there is a reluctor gear. You see there's some notch in it for the sensor to record its rotation. Once this pump is removed, inside this pump it's going to have a setup like the power steering. Basically it's going to be a rotor with a whole bunch of vane that has to sit inside of a cam ring. So when taking this stuff apart, it's going to want to fall apart on you, and it's most likely going to lead to confusion because you're not going to know how to put it back together. This is why you always have to consult with the factory service manual before you start taking this stuff apart. If you see this one bolt here is what's restricting us from lifting the back face of the pump off. You have to also look at all the bearing and the seal where you're grabbing. Make sure you don't damage it. You see how all the parts just fall out. So what this has tell us here is that this bell housing is one with the pump and cannot be separated. So the book is telling us something different than what we're seeing here. And the book, well, let's not talk about that. So we have confirmed that the pump is one with the transmission bell housing. This is the pump ring. This is the dowel pin that holds the pump ring in position. This is a retainer for the spring that has to be placed in position for centering this ring on this rotor with the vane. So we're going to remove this dowel pin, and I want to set this pump ring into this center rotor with this ring. That's the limiting ring preventing those vanes from moving back too far. So those vanes are the blades on the rotor that propel the fluid to create pressure force. Once this ring is placed in position, it's going to be most difficult because those blades or fin have to be set precisely inside that ring for it to seal properly. So here's another dowel pin that has to go with this bell housing, and there's this arm that's a fluid control. You'll notice it has to be placed one way and it's aligned with this ring for the pump, the seat flat. You want to take a look at this aluminum surface, making sure that it's absolutely smooth with no groove or gouges in it. Okay, so here I have the center rotor for all the blades to be fit into. We're going to assemble this back inside of the bell housing. This is the limitation ring. This black ring has to be placed in the center, and then it's going to be placed down onto the surface. Once that's placed in position, we want to basically center it, then placing this dowel pin for the pump ring. So there's one way for this pump ring. The smooth side is on the down side, and basically self-explanatory by looking at the video. But fitting these blades, these vanes, is very important. This smooth side must be on the outside. The side with the two notch on the back must be against the limitation ring on the inside. Very, very important. Failure to position these vanes in the correct location or position will most likely scuff the surface on the inside of the pump ring, damaging the pump. So this has to be done very carefully. Also, when assembling this pump, it has to be packed with Vaseline. That's a grease that's going to prevent cavitation of the pump when the transmission is in rotation by the engine. During new assembly, Vaseline must be placed in all the areas where friction or movement will be taking place. This Vaseline will promote suction of the fluid from the sump, bringing it up into the transmission for early and quick function. Failure to use the Vaseline will cause the pump to not produce pressure because it does not have a seal compartment for creating a vacuum or a suction or pulling the fluid up into the transmission casing. So once all these blades have been placed in position, then there's another ring that has to go on the top of the center rotor for limiting the blades movement inwards, and the outer ring is what limits the blade outwards, sealing compartment fluid. Now will be the best time to fill this turbine pump cavity with Vaseline to prevent cavitation. With the last blade in location, we want to install this cam ring return spring. Very important that the spring is in location for centering the cam ring around the shaft. This will have to be clipped into location. Then it has to be checked to make sure that it pivots on its dowel pin. Here we have another dowel pin that will pivot a control piston with two seals. These are the two seals. These are two neoprene rubber seal that is required for flow control, oil flow control. Very important that they are in location. We want to just remove them and reseat them. Then installing this control piston arm. So this will require compressing that spring, moving the cam ring for dropping that arm down into its cavity. Noticing those two notches with the cam ring and the arm similarly aligned. Replacing that center ring is to limit the blades from moving back and maintaining control of the blade against the cam-ring for oil pressure. It's time to place the rear face of the pump on. We want to inspect this needle roller bearing and all the seals on the shaft, making sure they have Vaseline when placing them back together. Cleaning the surface, washing out all the cavity is essential, all inside the pump when reassembling after rebuilding or replacing the parts. But this is simply just an inspection, and all these components will be cleaned and identified later during assembly. The parts will also be replaced. The bolts will require no Loctite or any kind of special solvent, just simply transmission fluid for torquing the factory specification. You do not want to use any kind of solvent on the bolts because those solvents can sometimes become washed off and contaminate the fluid. Always best to maintain a clean environment when assembling the automatic transmission. That is the most important part in building the transmission, is to make sure that you have no cloth or cardboard which will leave a fiber on the surface of the part, and when that fluid gets up into the transmission, it will wash all those fiber off, and that fiber could clog essential filter and passageway, limiting the performance of the transmission. That is one of the most way for preventing the transmission to not perform after it's been rebuilt. So cleanliness is the best way for a successful rebuild. This is the input shaft that the speed sensor has to record its signal from. So we have to take off this O-ring if we want to pass the shaft in from the rear of the pump, but it's not required to. But just to show you that when you put the shaft in the pump, it will fall right through. So this is to show you that nothing holds it back. Okay, let's get this bell housing and turbine pump in position for placing this input shaft, and this has proved to us that the bell housing and the pump is one, totally different from what the factory book has said. The manual in most cases that I've seen with Nissan is not the same as the physical part. So good luck. Okay, what we're looking at here is the reverse drum clutch assembly. Inside this drum is a set of clutches that require inspection to make sure that the transmission is valid for operation. We want to remove this band that holds the drum in position, and that will require unlocking this fastener, this nut with an Allen bolt. So what we want to do here is we just want to unlock this nut. Don't want to take it out completely because this is for alignment. Now that the nut is unlocked, with the nut unlocked, I want to turn it all the way back down, seating it onto the casting, using a Allen socket for releasing the studded shaft off the reverse clutch band. That band is what locks that reverse drum so the vehicle could go in reverse. So we want to release that stud just to get this band and this drum out of here. That band is also replaceable. In here are the clutches and the steel plates. When we take a look at inside this band, this is a friction material, and you can see it's in very good condition. This is another set of clutches and steel plates that are in here. This we're going to look at later on. What we want to go and look at is these sets of clutch and steel band inside this reverse drum, and we want to release this retainer clip that holds the pack of clutch in position. During assembling of this clutch pack, it's not required that you apply any Vaseline to the surface. You want to make sure you soak these clutch inside the transmission fluid and use transmission fluid inside this drum for assembling the clutch pack. This ring, once this ring is removed, all the clutches and steel plate will become much easier to access for inspection. Now that we have this retainer ring clip removed, you can lift the clutches out of the drum. You want to look at the reverse side, making sure it's brand new. Looking at the clutch, we want to see a unified color. We want to see that groove in the surface. That's telling us that this clutch is in excellent condition. So there's no dark discoloration. We also want to look at the steel band on the bottom. We're going to replace all of this. In another video, we're going to take a complete inspection look at all these clutches and steel band, looking for any deformation or wear and tear which will cause the transmission to not perform. So we want to always keep all these parts together. We want to put this clip back together, making sure that the clutches don't fall out. Everything must stay completely together, and you do not want these parts to develop into rust on the surface. You always keep them in a container or Ziploc bag so moisture stay off the steel, preventing corrosion to the parts and the steel liners. Alright, now we want to take a look at just placing this drum back onto this inner clutch. And you see those spline on the outside? Well, those spline has to align inside the drum on those tooth mark for the clutch. So it's going to require, when fitting this together, you're going to have to rotate it back and forth to align all the spline with those grooves on the clutch. You're going to know when the system is completely fitted together because the assembly is going to freewheel when it's rotating. So doing it with the transmission laying horizontal is going to become difficult. The transmission has to stand up on the tail, allowing easy installation of that drum and the clutch alignment with the spline. Here's what you want once this drum has been fully installed. When you rotate it, you want to hear the clutch just clicking into position. Since you have 3 clutches, it's going to make 3 drops, and then this whole drum will be able to freewheel when you rotate it by hand. That's one way. See how it freewheels? That's what you want. That's how you know when it's completely seated. Now we're going to install this band, and this part is what goes to the top, and this part is what goes to the bottom. So this band is activated by a accumulator on the bottom of the pan, inside the pan. We're going to take a look at all this later on during the transmission disassemble. We're just putting this back together for now because we're going to have to take the tail shaft off this transmission. Also, another thing, it's much easier rebuilding a transmission when it's in this position, mounted horizontal, or should I say vertical, up and down. You do not want it in the horizontal. So this is what we want. See how the band fit onto the accumulator and the threaded stud. Now we want to put the transmission back down and lock that bolt for the reverse band. So that's all the nuts and bolts. Basically, we're going to clean all this stuff up once it's disassembled. One important part is you do not want these parts to become corrosive. You want to inspect all these metal bushings. You want to make sure everything is secure. Safeguard against rust from the torque converter neck and all the other parts. You're going to place a rag on top of it to prevent moisture from developing on the surface to promote corrosion. This is the service manual of the diagram for the transmission bell housing and its front pump. This is a copy of the Nissan specification and is copyright protected, so we cannot show you the entire diagram or any complete information from this book because we will most likely pen a lawsuit. But this book is not accurate, as it has confirmed in our video with the wiring harness and now the transmission.